The air inside the old stone church of Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, on that sharp autumn morning of October 27, 1953, was dense with the smell of damp earth and forgotten things. It wasn't the familiar scent of beeswax and old hymns that usually filled the sanctuary. No, this was something far more ancient, far more potent, seeping up from beneath the very foundations themselves. Silas Croft, his back aching from years of farm work and a recent bout of rheumatism, used a calloused hand to wipe a bead of sweat from his brow. Beside him, his nephew, Jedediah, a man half his age but possessing twice the youthful impatience, grunted with effort as he pried at a stubborn stone. "This is it, Uncle Silas," Jedediah declared, his voice echoing faintly in the cavernous, dust-filled space beneath the main altar. The last one. For weeks, the small congregation had been abuzz with the news. The old church, a venerable structure dating back to the 1850s, was finally receiving its long-overdue renovation. The plans, meticulously drafted by a young architect from Philadelphia, included a modern heating system, which meant accessing the long-forgotten basement. A space that, according to local ordinance and faded church records, had been sealed off for 70 years. Not simply locked, but sealed. A thick wall of mortared stone had been erected, blocking the original entrance, and the only other access point, a heavy wooden trapdoor in the sacristy, had been nailed shut with iron spikes, then covered by a new floor laid sometime in the early 1900s. Reverend Thorne, a man of quiet demeanor and scholarly pursuits, had initially been skeptical. Perhaps it was just deemed unsafe, a structural concern, he'd suggested, peering over his spectacles at the yellowed blueprints. But the older members of the congregation, Silas among them, knew better. A hushed reverence, almost of fear, would descend whenever the old basement was mentioned, a collective memory passed down through generations of something unsettling. Now, the moment of truth had come. The renovation crew, mostly local men, had spent days carefully dismantling the newer floorboards in the sacristy, revealing the ancient trapdoor. It was a formidable thing, made of thick oak and banded with rusted iron. The spikes, driven deep into the surrounding beams, had resisted every attempt to pull them out. Eventually, Jedediah, with his youthful strength and a heavy crowbar, had managed to splinter the wood around them, weakening their hold. The air grew colder as the last spike groaned free. A gust of stale, earthy air, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible odor, wafted up. It was not exactly the smell of decay, but something akin to forgotten earth, damp stone, and a hint of something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. It was a smell that prickled the back of the throat, a taste of history. "Careful now, Jedediah," Silas cautioned, his voice rough with anticipation. He felt a tremor run through him, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the weight of 70 years of unspoken questions pressing down. Jedediah braced himself, his muscles straining. With a final, guttural cry, he heaved. The trapdoor, protesting with a long, drawn-out shriek of tortured wood and rusted hinges, slowly began to lift. Dust, thick and ancient, billowed upwards, catching the weak rays of sunlight filtering through the sacristy window. It danced in the air like a ghostly curtain, momentarily obscuring their view. As the dust settled, a gaping black maw was revealed. A set of rough-hewn stone steps, slick with what looked like perpetual dampness, descended into absolute darkness. The air that now flowed freely from below was noticeably colder, carrying that same peculiar, unsettling scent, now stronger, more defined. It was the smell of a place long undisturbed, a tomb of forgotten time. Reverend Thorne, who had been observing from a respectful distance, stepped forward, his face a mixture of apprehension and academic curiosity. He held a powerful, battery-operated lantern, a modern marvel, which he now switched on. A beam of bright, artificial light pierced the gloom, cutting through the swirling dust motes and illuminating the first few steps. "Well," the Reverend said, his voice barely a whisper. "It seems we've found it." Silas peered into the darkness, his eyes, though aged, still sharp. He could make out the rough texture of the stone walls, the faint glint of moisture. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets outside and the rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep within the newly opened space. It was a silence that spoke volumes. A silence that had held its breath for 7 decades, waiting for this moment. Jedediah, ever the pragmatist, was already reaching for a coil of rope. "Someone needs to go down there, Uncle. See what's what." Silas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the inky blackness. He felt a strange pull, a sense of obligation. His grandfather had been a deacon in this very church, had lived through the time when the basement was sealed. He had always been tight-lipped about it, a shadow passing over his face whenever the subject arose. Now, Silas felt a generational weight, a duty to finally uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. "I'll go," Silas said, his voice firm, surprising even himself. "I'll go first." The Reverend hesitated. "Perhaps we should wait for daylight, Mr. Croft. Or at least have more men present." "No," Silas insisted, already beginning to descend the first slippery step. The cold seeped into his bones, a chill that felt older than the stones themselves. Some things are best faced without a crowd, and some secrets. They don't wait for the sun. As Silas disappeared into the darkness, the beam of Reverend Thorn's lantern following him, Jedediah and the others exchanged uneasy glances. The church, usually a place of comfort and light, now felt like a silent sentinel guarding a profound, unsettling secret. The 70 years of silence had finally been broken, but what would emerge from its depths remained to be seen. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the past to finally reveal itself. The descent into the church basement was slow and deliberate. Each step Silas took echoed unnervingly in the confined space, amplified by the damp stone walls. The air grew heavier, colder, and the peculiar scent intensified, a mix of mineral earth, stagnant water, and something else, something subtly organic, like dried leaves or very old wood. Reverend Thorn, holding the lantern aloft, followed closely, his breath misting in the frigid air. Jedediah, ever cautious, remained at the top, ready to assist with the rope. The beam of the lantern cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing a long, narrow chamber. The walls were rough-hewn field stone, mortared with a dark, almost black substance. The floor was packed earth, uneven and damp with patches of glistening moisture. There were no windows, no obvious ventilation, just the suffocating embrace of the earth. "It's larger than I imagined," Reverend Thorn whispered, his voice hushed with awe and a touch of trepidation. Silas, now standing on the earthen floor, swept the lantern beam across the space. It was mostly empty, save for a few broken wooden crates lying scattered in one corner, their contents long since rotted away or removed. A rusted iron shovel leaned against a wall, its blade caked with dried mud. Cobwebs, thick and heavy, draped from the low ceiling like ancient shrouds, swaying almost imperceptibly in the disturbed air. "Looks like a storage room," Jedediah called down, his voice muffled. "Nothing much to see, Uncle." But Silas felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just a storage room. The way it had been sealed, the sheer effort involved, suggested something more. He ran his hand along the cold, rough stone of the wall. It felt solid, unyielding. As the lantern beam continued its slow sweep, it illuminated a section of the far wall. Unlike the rough fieldstone of the rest of the chamber, this part was smoother, made of cut blocks, and seemed to protrude slightly. It was almost as if a section had been built into the existing wall, or perhaps over something. "Hold the light steady, Reverend," Silas instructed, his voice low. He approached the anomaly, his boots crunching softly on the damp earth. The mortar between these cut stones was different, too, lighter in color, almost like a patch job. He pressed his palm against the cool stone. It felt solid, but there was a subtle difference in the resonance when he tapped it with his knuckles. A faint, hollow sound. "There's something behind this," Silas murmured, more to himself than to the others. He traced the outline of the smoother section. It was roughly rectangular, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. Too small for a door, too large for a simple niche. Reverend Thorn, his curiosity piqued, moved closer, shining the lantern directly onto the suspicious section. A false wall perhaps, or a sealed-off alcove. Silas knelt, examining the base of the wall. The packed earth here seemed slightly disturbed, as if something had been dragged or pushed against it. He noticed a faint, almost invisible seam running vertically up the side of the smoother stone section, barely discernible beneath a thin layer of grime. "Jedediah, bring me that shovel," Silas called up. "And a pickaxe if you can find one." Jedediah quickly complied, lowering the tools on the rope. Silas took the shovel, carefully scraping away the loose earth at the base of the suspected false wall. He found no obvious cracks or openings, but the faint seam persisted. He then took the pickaxe, its heavy head feeling cold and solid in his hands. "Are you sure, Mr. Croft?" Reverend Thorn asked, a note of concern in his voice. "We don't want to damage the church's structure unnecessarily." "This isn't structural, Reverend," Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the wall. "This is a cover-up." He raised the pickaxe, its shadow dancing wildly on the wall in the lantern light. With a grunt, he brought it down, not with full force, but with a controlled strike, aiming for the mortar line of the seam. *Thack, *, a shower of dust and small stone fragments flew. The sound was dull, not the sharp crack of solid stone, but a muffled thud, confirming his suspicion. The mortar, though old, was brittle. He struck again and again, widening the crack. The peculiar scent in the air seemed to thicken, becoming more pungent, more insistent. It was still not the smell of outright decay, but something akin to very old, dry wood, mixed with a faint, sweetish undertone that was deeply unsettling. After several minutes of painstaking work, a small gap appeared. Silas dropped the pickaxe and knelt, peering into the narrow opening. The lantern light, directed by Reverend Thorn, streamed into the void. What they saw sent a shiver down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It wasn't another chamber, not yet. It was a small, dark recess, barely large enough for a man to stand in. And within that recess, tucked away in the deepest shadow, was a small wooden object. It was low to the ground, roughly carved, and seemed to be draped with something pale and tattered. "What is it?" Reverend Thorn breathed, his voice barely audible. Silas reached a trembling hand into the gap, his fingers brushing against the rough wood. It was a small, crudely built crib, and draped over its side, faded and brittle with age, was a tiny, yellowed baby blanket. A profound silence descended upon the basement, heavier and more chilling than before. The implications were immediate, stark, and deeply disturbing. This was not a storage room. This was not a structural concern. This was a place where something, or someone, had been hidden, and the 70 years of silence suddenly felt less like a mystery and more like a deliberate act of concealment. Silas pulled his hand back, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked at Reverend Thorn, whose eyes were wide with dawning horror. The air, once merely cold, now felt heavy with unspoken grief, a palpable sorrow that had been trapped within these stone walls for generations. "Jedediah," Silas called up, his voice strained. "We're going to need more than a pickaxe. We need to get this wall down carefully." The younger man, sensing the shift in atmosphere, descended quickly. The discovery of the crib and blanket had transformed the mundane task of renovation into an archaeological excavation of a deeply personal, deeply tragic past. The church, a symbol of comfort and faith, had suddenly revealed a hidden, unsettling face, and the true nature of the 70-year secret was just beginning to unfold. The removal of the false wall was a slow, painstaking process. Silas, Jedediah, and Reverend Thorn worked in shifts, carefully prying away the stones, conscious of the fragile nature of what lay beyond. Each stone removed felt like peeling back a layer of time, revealing more of the heavy, stagnant air, and the unsettling scent that now seemed to cling to their clothes. As the opening widened, the small recess was fully revealed. It was indeed a cramped space, barely 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, carved directly into the earth and lined with rough-hewn planks of wood, long since warped and splintered by the damp. The crib, crude and small, stood against the back wall. Its wooden frame was dark with age, and the tattered blanket, once perhaps a soft white or pale yellow, was now a brittle, faded husk. Silas reached in first, his movements cautious. He gently lifted the blanket. Beneath it, the crib was empty. A wave of relief, quickly followed by a deeper sense of dread, washed over him. Empty, yes. But the presence of the crib itself was a chilling testament. Beside the crib, tucked into a corner, was a small wooden chest, no larger than a shoebox. It was plain, unadorned, and secured with a simple, rusted iron latch. Silas carefully pulled it out. The wood was cold and damp to the touch, and a faint, metallic smell emanated from it. "What's inside?" Jedediah whispered, his usual boisterousness replaced by a quiet solemnity. Reverend Thorn, his face etched with concern, nodded towards the chest. "We should open it here. Whatever secrets this place holds, they are part of this church's history." Silas carefully unlatched the chest. The rusted metal groaned, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the silent basement. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed cloth, were several items. The first was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. It was smooth to the touch, worn by countless caresses, and seemed to be made of a dark, polished wood. It was clearly a child's toy, a comfort object. Next, a small, leather-bound book. Its cover, faded and cracked. It looked like a journal, and beneath it, a stack of letters tied with a thin, brittle ribbon that crumbled to dust as Silas touched it. Finally, at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of linen, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was simple, unadorned, and felt surprisingly heavy in Silas's palm. He opened it with a delicate click. Inside, two faded daguerreotypes. One, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, wearing a clerical collar. The other, a young woman, her expression gentle but tinged with a hint of sadness, holding what appeared to be a swaddled infant. The image was blurry, indistinct, but the implication was clear. "Reverend Caldwell," Silas murmured, recognizing the face from an old portrait in the church vestibule, and a woman and a child. Reverend Thorn gasped softly. Elias Caldwell was the pastor here during the Great Winter of 1882 to 1883. He disappeared without a trace shortly after. It was always assumed he was lost in a blizzard, or perhaps fell into the river during the spring thaw. The pieces began to click into place, forming a chilling mosaic: the sealed basement, the crib, the baby blanket, the child's toy, and now the locket with the pastor's image and a woman with an infant. This was not just a secret. It was a tragedy, carefully hidden away. Jedediah, who had been peering over Silas's shoulder, pointed to a small, almost invisible indentation on the wooden floor of the recess near where the crib had stood. "Look, Uncle, there's something else here." Silas leaned closer. The indentation was faint, a shallow groove in the old wood. He ran his finger along it. It felt like a worn path, as if something had been repeatedly dragged across it. He followed the groove with his eyes, and it led to a section of the wooden lining that seemed slightly looser than the rest. With careful effort, Silas managed to pry up the loose plank. Beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was another, smaller package. This one was wrapped in oilcloth, offering some protection from the moisture. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small wooden doll, crudely carved, but with a distinct, almost haunting expression on its painted face. Its clothes, made of scraps of fabric, were tiny and delicate. And beside it, a single, small, leather-bound shoe, clearly belonging to an infant. The air in the recess grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The empty crib, the baby blanket, the child's toy, the locket, the doll, the shoe, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. A child, or perhaps children, had been here, and then they were gone. This is a grave," Reverend Thorn whispered, his voice trembling. "Not a literal one, perhaps, but a place of remembrance, or of concealment." Silas looked at the items, then at the empty crib, then back at the faces of Jedediah and Reverend Thorn, both pale and shaken. The initial curiosity had given way to a profound sense of sorrow and a chilling realization. The 70 years of silence weren't just about forgetting. They were about burying a truth too painful, too scandalous, or too morally compromising to ever see the light of day. "We need to read these," Silas said carefully, gathering the journal and letters. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "We need to know what happened here, what Reverend Caldwell did, and why this was all hidden away." The basement, once a mere architectural curiosity, had transformed into a silent witness. Its cold stone walls holding the echoes of a forgotten past. The hidden secrets, now brought to light, promised a story far more complex and tragic than any of them could have imagined. The true horror was not in what they saw, but in the implications of what they had yet to uncover. Back in the sacristy, the small collection of artifacts lay spread out on a makeshift table, illuminated by the harsh glare of the electric lantern. The journal, the letters, the locket, the wooden bird, the doll, the tiny shoe. Each item, a silent testament to a story waiting to be told. The air, even outside the basement, still carried a faint trace of that peculiar, unsettling scent. Reverend Thorn, his scholarly instincts now fully engaged, carefully picked up the leather-bound journal. Its cover was brittle, the pages yellowed and fragile. He opened it with extreme care, revealing neat, precise handwriting, though faded in places. "It is indeed Reverend Elias Caldwell's journal," he confirmed, his voice hushed. "The first entry is dated November 12, 1882. Silas and Jedediah leaned in, their eyes fixed on the ancient script. The first few entries were mundane, detailing church affairs, weather observations, and the general well-being of the Oak Haven community. But as Reverend Thorn read on, the tone began to shift. November 28, 1882. The snow has begun in earnest. A heavy fall last night. The roads are already treacherous. Pray for safe passage for those traveling. December 5, 1882. The cold is relentless. Old Man Hemlock's livestock perished in the night. Food stores are dwindling faster than anticipated. A cough has begun to spread through the village, particularly amongst the children. May God protect us. The entries grew increasingly grim, painting a vivid picture of a community under siege. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was known in local history as the Great Freeze, a period of unprecedented cold and isolation. But Caldwell's journal added a terrifying new dimension. December 18, 1882. The cough has worsened. It is not merely a cough. It is a fever, a wasting sickness. Young Thomas Miller, barely 5 years old, passed this morning. His mother, Lydia, is inconsolable. Fear grips the hearts of the flock. I pray for strength to guide them. December 26, 1882. The sickness spreads like wildfire. It takes the young, the old, the weak. Dr. Albright is overwhelmed. We have buried 3 more souls this week. The ground is frozen solid. We must dig with pickaxes and fire to soften the earth. The despair is palpable. The journal detailed the relentless march of the epidemic, a combination of influenza and diphtheria which ravaged the isolated community. Food became scarce, medical supplies non-existent. The entries became shorter, more frantic, reflecting Caldwell's growing desperation. January 10, 1883. The stores are nearly depleted. The snowdrifts are higher than a man's head. No one can get in. No one can get out. We are cut off. The sickness claims more lives each day. The cries of the children. God forgive me. The cries. January 15, 1883. A terrible decision must be made. The weakest among us, they consume resources we cannot spare. The mothers too frail to nurse. The infants too small to survive this cold, this hunger, this plague. We cannot save them all. A choice must be made. For the survival of the many. A chilling silence filled the sacristy. Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The implications of Caldwell's words were horrifying. The weakest among us, a choice must be made. What does he mean, the weakest? Jedediah asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Reverend Thorne continued to read, his brow furrowed. It seems the epidemic, combined with the extreme isolation and lack of resources, pushed the community to the brink. Caldwell was faced with an impossible choice: sacrifice some to save others. Then, Reverend Thorne turned to the stack of letters. They were addressed to Caldwell, some from other church elders, others from concerned parishioners. They spoke of the dire situation, the dwindling food, the constant burials. But one letter, written in a more elegant, flowing hand, stood out. It was dated January 20th, 1883, and signed, Lydia Miller. Reverend Thorne began to read it aloud, his voice trembling slightly. Reverend Caldwell, I implore you, reconsider this terrible path. These are God's children, no less than any other. To separate them, to condemn them to such a fate, is an abomination. My own Thomas, may he rest in peace, was taken by the sickness. But I would never have wished this upon him. There must be another way. We can share what little we have. We can pray. But this is not the Lord's work. I cannot, in good conscience, stand by and watch this unfold. I will speak out. I will tell the others what you plan for the unwanted. God help us all if you proceed. The letter dropped from Reverend Thorne's trembling fingers. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of Silas's own heart. The unwanted, Silas repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The children. The crib. The doll. The shoe. The pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place, forming a picture far more sinister than a simple structural concern or a forgotten storage room. The sealed basement, the hidden recess, the child's belongings, Caldwell's desperate entries, and Lydia Miller's impassioned plea. They all pointed to a dark secret, a moral compromise made in the crucible of an unimaginable winter. This is an unspeakable tragedy, Reverend Thorne finally managed to say, his face pale. A desperate act, born of desperation. But what happened to them? To the children? And to Lydia Miller, who threatened to expose it? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, yet their implications were clear. The cryptic documents had opened a window into a past of unimaginable suffering and a terrible choice. The 70 years of silence were not just about forgetting. They were about burying a truth that had haunted Oak Haven for generations. A truth that was now slowly, painfully coming to light. The true horror was not in the supernatural, but in the depths of human despair, and the choices made when survival itself is at stake. The journal of Reverend Elias Caldwell became their primary guide, a chilling chronicle of a community's descent into desperation. Reverend Thorne, with his steady hand and academic precision, continued to transcribe the faded entries, while Silas and Jedediah listened, their faces grim. The narrative unfolded like a slow-motion tragedy, each page turning, revealing another layer of Caldwell's moral struggle. January 22nd, 1883. Lydia Miller confronts me. Her grief for her own child has sharpened her resolve. She speaks of God's judgment, of abomination. She does not understand the necessity. The choice is not between good and evil, but between two evils, to let all perish, or to save some. The infants, those born without a father, those whose mothers are too weak to nurse, those whose families have already succumbed to the sickness. They are the ones we cannot sustain. Their cries weaken the resolve of the healthy. Their needs drain the last of our meager stores. Caldwell's entries revealed a man tormented, convinced he was making a terrible but necessary sacrifice. He believed he was acting as a shepherd, culling the weakest of the flock to ensure the survival of the stronger. The basement, he wrote, was to be a sanctuary, a place where these unwanted could be kept, away from the eyes of the community, away from the dwindling resources, until the winter broke and help could arrive. A desperate lie, he told himself, and perhaps some of the elders. January 25, 1883. The first 3 have been brought to the lower chamber. Sister Agnes assists me. Her faith is unwavering, her resolve stronger than my own. She understands the gravity of our task. We have prepared the space as best we can, with what little we have. Blankets, a few small bowls of gruel. It is cold, so terribly cold. But it is better than the alternative, I tell myself. Better than the slow, agonizing death in the arms of a starving mother. The mention of Sister Agnes sent a fresh wave of unease through Silas. He remembered her from his childhood, a stern, unsmiling woman who had lived to a ripe old age, always dressed in black, her eyes holding a distant, haunted look. Now, her complicity in Caldwell's terrible plan cast a new, chilling light on her memory. The journal entries became more fragmented, more emotionally charged. Caldwell's handwriting grew less steady, reflecting his deteriorating mental state. He wrote of the constant wails from below, the gnawing guilt, the desperate prayers for a swift end to the winter, for a miracle. February 1, 1883. More have been brought. The number grows. The silence above ground is a lie. The true sounds of Oak Haven are below, in the dark. My soul is stained. I see their faces in my dreams. Small, innocent faces. God, what have I done? What have we done? February 8, 1883. Lydia Miller continues to threaten. She speaks of going to the authorities, of exposing our secret to the outside world once the road's clear. She does not comprehend the ruin this would bring upon Oak Haven. The shame, the judgment, all our sacrifices for naught. She must be silenced. For the good of the community. For the good of those who remain. This entry sent a jolt through Silas. Asterisk she must be silenced. Asterisk the words hung in the air, heavy with menace. It wasn't just about the children anymore. It was about protecting the secret, protecting the community from the moral fallout. Reverend Thorne paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. This is a confession, Mr. Croft. A confession of a man driven to the edge, making choices he believed were for the greater good, but which ultimately led him down a dark path. Jedediah, who had been pacing restlessly, stopped. So he put the children down there to die. To starve or freeze. His voice was raw with anger and disbelief. He believed he was giving them a sanctuary, Silas said, his voice flat. A place where they wouldn't drain the resources of the healthy, a place where their suffering wouldn't be seen, wouldn't break the spirit of the survivors. A terrible, twisted logic born of desperation. The journal continued, detailing Caldwell's increasing paranoia about Lydia Miller. He saw her as a threat to the fragile peace, a danger to the very fabric of the community he was trying to preserve. He wrote of her unwavering moral compass, her refusal to accept his necessary evil. February 15, 1883. The thaw has begun, slowly, painfully. But Lydia's resolve has not. She speaks openly now to anyone who will listen, of the unwanted in the basement. She speaks of my sin, of the elders' complicity. She will destroy us all. I cannot allow it. The secret must remain buried. For Oak Haven. The final entry in Caldwell's journal was dated February 18, 1883. It was short, stark, and chilling. The choice is made. May God have mercy on my soul, and on hers. The journal ended there. A profound silence descended upon the sacristy, heavier than any they had experienced in the basement. The Reverend's confession was complete, but it left a gaping, terrifying question. What choice had been made on February 18th? And what had happened to Lydia Miller? Silas looked at the wooden bird, the doll, the tiny shoe, the innocent relics of a terrible secret. The Reverend's confession had revealed the motive, the desperation, and the moral abyss into which Oak Haven had fallen. But the full horror of the events, and the fate of Lydia Miller, remained shrouded in the lingering shadows of the past. The 70 years of silence had protected a truth far more complex and morally ambiguous than simple abandonment. It was a truth that now demanded to be fully unearthed. The revelation of Caldwell's final journal entry, "The choice is made. May God have mercy on my soul and on hers," left a palpable chill in the sacristy. The focus of their investigation shifted from the tragic fate of the unwanted children to the ominous disappearance of Lydia Miller. She was the woman who knew too much. The conscience of a community driven to desperate measures. Reverend Thorne, his hands still trembling slightly, began to sort through the remaining letters found in the wooden chest. Most were from other church elders, confirming the dire conditions Caldwell described. They spoke of the burden of the sick and the necessity of difficult decisions, though none explicitly mentioned the basement or the children. Their language was veiled, hinting at a collective understanding without direct admission. But then, Reverend Thorne found a small, folded piece of paper tucked away at the bottom of the stack. It was not a letter, but a single, hastily written note, dated February 17, 1883, the day before Caldwell's final journal entry. The handwriting was different, more hurried, less refined than Lydia Miller's previous letter. It was signed simply, L. He knows. He knows I will not be silent. He speaks of preserving Oak Haven, but it is a preservation built on sin. I have spoken to Thomas Albright, to Martha. They are torn, but their fear of ruin is greater than their compassion. Sister Agnes is a stone. I will not let this stand. I will go to the bridge tomorrow at dawn. The thaw is enough. I will find a way out, and I will tell the world. They must know. God forgive me for what I must do, but I cannot live with this secret. They cannot hide it forever. Reverend Thorne read the note aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The implications were stark. Lydia Miller was not just threatening. She was actively planning to leave Oak Haven and expose the truth. And Caldwell knew it. The bridge, Silas murmured, his mind racing. The old wooden bridge over Miller's Creek. It was the only way in or out of Oak Haven during the winter months, before the new road was built in the 1920s. Jedediah's eyes widened. So, she was going to leave, to tell everyone, and Caldwell couldn't allow that. Reverend Thorne concluded, his voice heavy. The shame, the scandal, the potential legal repercussions for the entire community. It would have destroyed Oak Haven, not just its reputation, but its very existence. The narrative of Lydia Miller began to take shape. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, recently widowed by the epidemic. Her own child, taken by the same cruel hand. Her personal grief had fueled her empathy, making her unable to accept the cold, utilitarian logic of Caldwell and the elders. She saw the unwanted children not as a burden, but as innocent lives deserving of protection. Her moral compass, unlike Caldwell's, remained unbent by desperation. Silas remembered faint whispers from his childhood, stories of a tragic accident at the bridge during the Great Freeze, a young woman caught in the sudden spring thaw, swept away by the swollen creek. It was always presented as a natural disaster, a sad consequence of a harsh winter. But now, with Lydia's note and Caldwell's final entry, the narrative shifted from accident to something far more sinister. Do you think Caldwell pushed her? Jedediah asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked at the locket, at the faded image of Caldwell and the young woman with the infant. The woman in the locket, he now realized, was likely Lydia Miller, holding her own child, Thomas, before the epidemic claimed him. Caldwell, the stone-faced pastor, and Lydia, the compassionate midwife. A tragic irony. Caldwell was a man of God, Reverend Thorne interjected, his voice strained. A man of faith. To commit such an act, it would be a complete shattering of his soul. Desperate times, Reverend, Silas countered, his voice grim. Caldwell's journal shows a man unraveling, convinced he was doing God's work by making terrible choices. He saw Lydia as a threat to everything he was trying to preserve. To him, silencing her might have been another necessary evil dot. The note from Lydia, found hidden amongst the other documents, was a desperate cry for justice, a final act of defiance. It painted her as a tragic figure, a martyr to a terrible secret. Her determination to expose the truth, even at great personal risk, highlighted the moral chasm between her and the desperate community. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of their discovery. The story of the sealed basement was no longer just about the forgotten children. It was about the lengths to which a community, led by its spiritual guide, would go to protect a terrible secret, and the tragic fate of the one person who dared to challenge it. The stage was set for the final, horrifying act of the Oak Haven tragedy. The night everything changed. The pieces of the puzzle, though still incomplete, now formed a chilling picture. The unwanted children in the basement, Caldwell's desperate rationale, Lydia Miller's unwavering moral stand, and her threat to expose the truth. All converged on the night of February 18, 1883, the date of Caldwell's final, ominous journal entry. Silas, Jedediah, and Reverend Thorne sat in the sacristy, the weight of the past pressing down on them. The air was heavy with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of Oak Haven's darkest hour. "The bridge," Silas began, his voice low. Lydia's note said she would go to the bridge at dawn. Caldwell's last entry was dated the same day. "It's too much of a coincidence." Reverend Thorne nodded slowly. The spring thaw that year was particularly brutal. The creek would have been swollen, the ice breaking up. A treacherous crossing, even in daylight. They imagined the scene. Lydia Miller, fueled by grief and a burning sense of injustice, making her way through the pre-dawn gloom, determined to escape Oak Haven and reveal its terrible secret. And Caldwell, driven by fear and a twisted sense of duty, intercepting her. There were no more documents to explicitly detail what happened. Caldwell's journal ended abruptly. Lydia's note was her last testament. The rest was left to inference, to the chilling logic of human desperation. He wouldn't have used violence. Reverend Thorne mused, almost to himself. Not directly. Caldwell was a man of God, however flawed. But a confrontation, an argument, near the treacherous bridge. Silas remembered the old stories. The bridge, a rickety wooden structure, was often slick with ice and mud during the thaw. A sudden push, a loss of balance, a desperate struggle on the unstable planks. The roar of the swollen creek below, ready to swallow secrets whole. Perhaps it was an accident, Jedediah offered, though his voice lacked conviction. A struggle. She slipped. He tried to save her, and she was swept away. Or perhaps, Silas countered, his gaze distant, he didn't try hard enough. Or perhaps he ensured she slipped. He wrote, "The choice is made. May God have mercy on my soul and on hers." That sounds like a deliberate act, Jedediah. A final, terrible decision to silence the truth. The image formed in their minds. Caldwell, desperate and tormented, confronting Lydia, her impassioned pleas, her accusations, her unwavering resolve to expose him and the community. His own fear of ruin, of scandal, of the destruction of everything he believed he was protecting. A moment of panic, a desperate lunge, a push, or simply a failure to act when she stumbled. The splash, the sudden silence, the raging current carrying her away. And then the aftermath. Caldwell, alone on the bridge, the weight of his actions crushing him. The children still in the basement, their cries perhaps still echoing faintly in his mind. The secret, now doubly sealed, by the stone walls below, and by the cold waters of Miller's Creek. What happened to Caldwell then? Jedediah asked, breaking the heavy silence. He disappeared too, didn't he? Reverend Thorne consulted his notes. Yes. His disappearance was reported a few days later. The official story was that he, too, was lost in the thaw, perhaps while searching for Lydia Miller. A tragic double loss for the community. But now, with the journal and Lydia's note, the official story felt like another layer of concealment. Caldwell, consumed by guilt and the enormity of his actions, might have simply vanished, fled Oak Haven, unable to live with his conscience. Or perhaps, in a final act of despair, he too sought the cold embrace of the creek, a self-imposed penance for his sins. The journal offered no answers, only the chilling finality of his last words. The community, already reeling from the epidemic and the harsh winter, would have been quick to accept the convenient narrative of a tragic accident. It allowed them to bury the truth, to protect their reputation, and to move forward, however scarred. The basement, with its terrible secret, would have been sealed with haste, the false wall erected, the trapdoor nailed shut, ensuring that the past remained buried, literally and figuratively. Silas looked at the small wooden doll, the tiny shoe, the innocent victims of a desperate time, and Lydia Miller, the woman who dared to speak truth to power, silenced by the very community she sought to save. So the basement was sealed not just to hide the children, Silas concluded, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation, but to bury the evidence of what happened to Lydia. To bury the shame, the guilt, the collective sin of Oak Haven. Reverend Thorne nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, Mr. Croft. A community choosing to protect itself from a truth it could not bear to face. A truth that would have shattered its very foundation. The night everything changed was not just a night of tragedy, but a night of moral compromise, of secrets buried deep, and of a collective silence that would last for 70 years. The horror was not in a monster, but in the choices made by ordinary people pushed to their limits by extraordinary circumstances. The true terror lay in the human capacity for both compassion and cruelty, and the thin line that separated them when survival was at stake. The final pieces of Oak Haven's dark puzzle had fallen into place, revealing a story of desperation, moral compromise, and a secret buried for 70 years. Silas, Jedediah, and Reverend Thorne sat in the sacristy, surrounded by the relics of the past. The silence, now heavy with understanding, rather than mystery. The basement had been sealed for a multitude of reasons, each layer of concealment adding to the profound silence that followed. Firstly, there was the immediate horror of the unwanted children. Caldwell's journal, however twisted its logic, revealed a desperate attempt to manage an impossible situation, to save the many by sacrificing the few. The sight of those children slowly succumbing to cold and hunger would have been a constant, unbearable reminder of the community's failure, a drain on the morale of the survivors. Sealing them away was a desperate act to preserve the sanity and hope of those who remained. Secondly, there was the tragic fate of Lydia Miller. Her unwavering moral stance, her threat to expose the truth, forced Caldwell's hand. Her disappearance, whether accidental or orchestrated, was a direct consequence of her knowledge. The community, complicit in the basement's secret, would have had every reason to ensure her silence, to accept the convenient narrative of a tragic accident at the bridge. To admit otherwise would have invited scandal, legal repercussions, and the complete ruin of Oak Haven's reputation. Thirdly, and perhaps most powerfully, there was the collective guilt. The elders who supported Caldwell, the families who turned a blind eye, the entire community that benefited from the sacrifice, all shared in the burden of the secret. To acknowledge it, to speak of it, would have been to admit their own complicity, their own moral failings in the face of unimaginable hardship. Silence became their shield, a pact forged in desperation and maintained by fear. Silas looked at the wooden bird, the doll, the tiny shoe. These were not just artifacts. They were silent witnesses. Their innocence a stark contrast to the darkness they represented. The locket with Caldwell and Lydia spoke of a complex relationship, perhaps even a shared past, now irrevocably stained by tragedy. So they just lived with it? Jedediah asked, his voice barely a whisper. For 70 years, knowing what was down there? People are capable of extraordinary things, Jedediah, Silas replied, his gaze fixed on the ancient journal. Both good and terrible. And the human mind is remarkably adept at burying what it cannot bear to face. They built new lives, raised families, rebuilt Oak Haven. But the secret, I imagine, was always there. A shadow at the edge of their vision, a chill in the air they couldn't quite explain. Reverend Thorne nodded. The silence was a form of collective penance, perhaps. A way to move forward, but never truly to forget. The weight of that secret would have shaped generations, even if they didn't consciously know why. It would have manifested in unspoken anxieties, in a certain guardedness, in the very character of this town. The emotional resolution for Silas and Jedediah was not one of triumph, but of profound sadness and understanding. The mystery was solved, but the truth was a heavy burden. They had unearthed not a treasure, but a tragedy. The basement, once a source of fearful curiosity, was now a solemn memorial to the desperate choices made in a time of unimaginable suffering. "What do we do now, Reverend?" Silas asked, his voice weary. "Do we tell the congregation? Do we tell the world?" Reverend Thorne picked up Caldwell's journal, his fingers tracing the faded script. "The truth, Mr. Croft, is a powerful thing. It can heal, but it can also destroy. This story, it is a testament to human resilience, but also to human fallibility. It asks us to consider what we would do, what choices we would make, when faced with the absolute collapse of our world." He paused, looking from Silas to Jedediah. "Perhaps the first step is to honor those who were forgotten. To give them the dignity they were denied." He gestured to the small wooden items, and then, perhaps, to share this story. Not as a judgment, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder of the darkness that can emerge from desperation, and the enduring power of silence. What do you, the listener, think? Was the community's decision to seal the basement and bury the truth justified, given the extreme circumstances? Or was it an unforgivable act that stained Oak Haven for generations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Silas looked at the open trapdoor leading to the basement, now illuminated by the sacristy's electric light. The cold, damp air still rose, but it no longer felt mysterious. It felt like a sigh, a release of 70 years of pent-up grief and unspoken sorrow. The church, once a place of hidden darkness, was now a place of revealed truth. The renovation would continue. The new heating system would be installed. But the old basement would never truly be just a basement again. It would remain a silent monument to a winter that tested the very limits of human morality, to the children who were unwanted, and to the woman who knew too much. The 70 years of silence had ended, but the echoes of Oak Haven's past would forever resonate within its ancient stone walls. If this story of Oak Haven's hidden past has left you questioning the fine line between survival and sin, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of psychological mystery and forgotten history. The sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the churchyard. The wind, carrying the crisp scent of autumn leaves, whispered through the old oak trees, a timeless murmur that seemed to carry the weight of all the stories, spoken and unspoken, that had ever unfolded beneath their ancient branches. The secret of the old church basement was finally out, but its moral complexities would linger, a haunting question for all who dared to listen. What are your theories about what truly happened to Reverend Caldwell after that fateful night? Did he flee, or did he, too, become a victim of the unforgiving creek? Let us know your thoughts. The last rays of light faded, and the church, now holding its secrets in the open, settled into the quiet embrace of the night. Its past, finally, irrevocably, revealed.